Hi, Daniel. Good to see you again.
Hi, Efrain. Great to see you. Happy New Year.
Likewise, Happy New Year. Hope you had a good holiday season.
Yes, I did. And very excited to present this new episode of the new season of the newly named FMCG Guys podcast in alliance with our North American counterpart, the CPG Guys.
Yes, we're really excited to be working with Shri and Peter on this collaboration, and really excited and looking forward to sharing some really interesting conversations in the world of FMCG and retail with our audience in the coming year, or in this new year, I should say.
Yeah. Exactly like our guest today, actually. Antoine Collette. I think he'll set the bar quite high. He's an industry veteran who's worked across the globe and is currently heading up Henkel Beauty in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Hi, Antoine. Good afternoon. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for hosting me today. That's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. And as we were saying before, Efrain, it's the first episode of this new series of the FMCG Guys. So
yeah, thanks for joining us, Antoine. You are officially kicking us off into not only the new year, but this new podcast series. So it's a double bonus for us.
With pleasure. That's great. So we don't know what 2022 will be, but let's start by a good note and talk together about this.
I'm optimistic. So Antoine, you know that we have you here to speak about a bit about your leadership journey, what you've learned in your career, making it up to an SVP level. But actually, I always like to start in the podcast at some point, talk about like the human story behind the executive, so to speak. Interested to know how you actually started your career out of university or whatever education you had.
So I grew up globally. My career is pretty simple. I grew up as a marketer and grew up as a GM. That was my plan to become a general manager. I started marketing with the car industry in Austria, actually, for a French company. And this was also my first experience to work abroad. I'm currently out of my home country for now more than 15 years, 7 different moves with a family of 5 kids. So of course, it was not necessarily always easy, but extremely interesting. But very quickly, I knew marketing was my best and favorite topic. I was very interested in marketing because I think it's one of the most human part of the company. It's not only the human part of working with different part of the company and being the chief orchestra, I would say, but it's also because you are close to the consumers. You're putting yourself in the shoes of the consumer. You're trying to understand what they would do, what she would do, he would do. Even with product, you don't necessarily consume. So it's very much about understanding the way they would react. And I found it extremely interesting. So that's how my career started. What I liked also with marketing is that it was very much of a position where you could be really a generalist, touch a lot of different points within the company. And that really made me also interested on the diversity of the job.
Mm-hmm. When did you transition? So you started in the car industry, automobiles. When did you transition into our beloved world of FMCG?
Pretty quickly, actually, after 1.5 years, this was my period, was there finishing, and I decided to move back or to start really in FMCG at Henkel at that time. Because what I like in FMCG is exactly what you don't have in automobile, is the fast moving consumer goods. So you can do something, have an idea, and in, let's say, 6 months to 1 year, it's touching the ground, it's touching the consumer. And that's what's the exciting part. That's, of course, a bit stressful sometimes, but you can also adjust much more and see the impact that you have, even as a simple brand manager over the consumers. So that really excited me. And since then, I stayed in FMCG.
That's great. I saw that, like you said, your first foray into FMCG was with Henkel. Was that opportunity of that period when you were with Henkel, was that also when you had your first leadership experience as well?
Obviously I was trying to try to remember what was my first leadership experience. Obviously, it's more moving from assistant brand manager to brand manager. As a brand manager, you have an assistant. That's the first time where you try to see, okay, how can I, and again, putting yourself in the shoes of the others. How was I when I was an assistant brand manager, and how do I want to be treated now? And how I want to give a bit of experience, teach, coach, the people working in my team. But I have to be honest, I can realize that I was not necessarily a very good manager at that time, because I see you learning on the job. And the more you grow, the more you learn, the more you discover also that it's not about you only, it's about the team. And I would now consider myself as a much better manager, obviously. Bigger team for sure, but also much better awareness of what it means to be a manager. I want to come back to an experience which was maybe a fundamental experience for me in terms of leadership, was to become a marketing director in a non-French country, in a foreign country. First time was in Hungary. And I had a couple...
In Hungary and Central Europe?
In Central Europe, in Budapest, yes, exactly.
Had you lived in Hungary before?
No, this was the first time we again left France to live abroad. And this was the beginning of our big journey with my wife and my kids. It was in 2005, ending in Budapest and starting to have a team speaking English, obviously, because Hungarians, it's a pretty complicated language. And, having to manage a team of marketers, with the challenge of the culture, a bit the challenge of the language, of course, but also challenge of the brand history. Because you are managing brands, as it was in food at that time with Danone Biscuits business. And food, it's very much of a home business. It's very much of a childhood business, meaning that you remember the cakes, the biscuits, the chocolates you had with your grandma or with your mom. And you manage that as a consumer and you give it very often to your kids as a memory of those times. And being a marketing director, non-Hungarians to manage Hungarians' classical biscuits brands was not easy, was not obvious, but it was also extremely interesting because I could really take a step back and to say, what's the added value I could bring to that team? And I think it was also the distance, which was an added value because I could disconnect myself from only the attachment, but to say, why are the consumer buying us? What's the brand is really representing? What are we offering to the consumer, not only as the childhood memory, but also as the product benefit, consumer benefit? And I found it very challenging, I have to be honest, but also a great learning curve and a great source of inspiration for my next moves. And it was also the moment where I discovered that you're not only manager by authority or because you have the job, you're also manager because you add value to the team.
Yeah.
Perspective.
Well, I like how you mentioned this concept of emotional distance. And like you said, especially in a category like biscuits or snacks, where, like you said, there is that emotional connection to our childhood favorites. I think being able to have that emotional distance, in your case, because of the fact that you didn't grow up with those items, is really, really critical. And it's something that I think not a lot of people, not a lot of managers and leaders tend to take into account sometimes, at least early in their career. So that's great that you were able to identify that early on.
But when you move in different countries, you have to, because when I was covering, for example, biscuits for Asia and Middle East and Africa later in my career, you have to think, why would the Chinese consumer buy this product? Why would the Middle Eastern consumers, African consumers would buy that product? What would make them the same and would make them different? And one of the learning I would have also is to say, the more you travel to different teams, the more they are trying to explain you how different they are. And you, as the manager of those big regions, you are trying to explain them how similar they are and how similar they can become also. And therefore, you go back to the basics of marketing need. And emotionally, again, you have to be a bit distant because you have to be trying to make bridges between countries.
Yeah. And actually, if you go back to Hungary, for example, coming from abroad into a country like Hungary, which obviously, it's a very strong culture. As you said, the language is completely different. I know it's not even Indo-European. So we're talking about a very different culture. What situation did you find yourself in? Because I imagine that back then you must have been like in your 30s or something like that. So relatively unexperienced, going into a room full of people would probably have questions on you. How do you bridge that to make that a success?
You have to accept first that you will never talk to the sales guy because they don't speak English. I mean, most of the key accounts were even not speaking English. So you have to accept that in some cases, you will have to be also very simple in the way you would create your strategy and ask the sales team to execute your strategy. You have to understand that you don't necessarily understand everything in the detail, and therefore you have to create trust with your team. You create space for them to perform, and you just give the big directions. I think that's very important. But you also have to be extremely curious, because you cannot only pretend you don't understand the culture. It doesn't work. You have to try to, as a sponge, try to ask questions, listen to them, and reflect to say, oh, you're doing it that way or this way, or you're doing it the way you eat, the way you meet, the way you greet. And that I found it extremely interesting. I think I also moved in so many different countries because I'm very curious. And that's also what's driving me, this idea of discovering new frontier, new ways of working, new ways of doing. That's what made me what I am today. And I think I grew much faster by being like this, more than staying in my comfort zone, or at least in my own country.
So, Antoine, to that point, and you talked about this, I think, just by nature of being curious, which I think is definitely one of the principles that I try to live by as well. So it's great to hear that we have that in common. Can you tell me a little bit about how you find that right balance, particularly, like you said, moving into different cultures and working in different countries, between being hands-on from an executional standpoint and also strategic at the same time? I think finding that right balance is something that a lot of leaders say is critical to their success.
Sorry, and if I can add to that point, I think it's also about like being a marketing director in a country where it's all about, well, not all about, but a lot about activation and so on, into your current capacity where you're managing EMEA from an SVP standpoint, which is very high level.
Yeah, I mean, we all love to have nice strategies, and sometimes it's extremely exciting to develop them, to put them on a piece of paper, on a nice PowerPoint chart. But at the end of the day, it's also boiling down to execution, because if you don't execute your strategy in a nice way, you fail. And when you are in FMCG and you develop the strategy, you are also very often responsible for the execution. So that's the way I would describe, the link between a strategy and execution, or being strategic, but also hands-on. I'm not trying to be in the detail of everything, and I think it's not the added value I can bring to my team and to the business. But on very specific points, I would be very picky, and I would make sure that the strategy is very well executed. I'm very much passionate by packaging, for example, which is the first touch point that you have as a consumer. And when you shop, you sometimes have seen the ads, or you have seen your phone with any online videos or whatever, but very often you just discover the product, what you see in shop. And for me, that's why it's so important to have what placement you have, and also what packaging and design you have. And I discovered that very often the team is a bit neglecting that, or the team is making the packaging, for example, sometimes as a book. They want to say everything. They want to give all the benefits. They want to explain all the consumer benefits. But as a consumer, you just need one or two reasons to buy. And so that's where I could see that even as in a way, senior executive, you can still add value even to packaging by simplifying, by being straight to the point, even for the consumers. So that's the way I would see the link between execution and strategy, and making sure that the strategy is becoming understood by anyone, even the simple consumer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I love that. I mean, to me, I think the key word in your response is around simplicity. Is that I think striking for simplicity and achieving it can sometimes be a very difficult thing, but when you get it, it's magic. Not just for us from a strategic standpoint internally at companies, but also with consumers. Because I think, one thing that one of my old bosses always told me is that keep in mind that consumers really will look at an item in store for a total of maybe 2 to 3 seconds. So if you tried, like you said, to write a book on your packaging, it's just going to be clutter and background to them, and they're just going to move right past it.
Yeah, and most of the most successful brands are the simplest one, or at least they have a simple execution. They are not necessarily simple in their proposition or in their strategy and so on, but they appear pretty simple to the consumer, at least the brand from FMCG. Yes.
Curious to know, now that we're at this point, I mean, we're talking about packaging, for example, and obviously you've talked a lot about marketing. How did you transition from marketing to being a general manager from, the mindset point of view?
I mean, this was my dream, to become a general manager. And I think marketing is getting you very ready for that, because as a brand manager, at least in the old way, you were trying to manage everything around your brand, being media, being purchasing, being design, being product, visiting the factories, so you had to understand really how your product was done, produced, designed, costed, and distributed. So in a way, you are a mini GM, you are a mini general manager when you're a strong brand manager. And I think that's really what's making you ready for that. And when I moved as a GM, obviously at the beginning, it's a bit scary because you look at your team and you look at your multifunctional team. So you have all the functions reporting to you and you say, wow, now I'm not only the marketing boss, I'm the boss of everyone. So very quickly, I could move from, obviously a bit of fear to interest, curiosity. You have to accept that you will not be the best on everything, and you will not need to add value to everything you touch. You have people in your team who knows better their function that you do. That's okay. And then you come back to your point, Ephraim, about simplicity, and then trying to think, where do you bring common sense, for example? I think this is the distance that you bring and the elevator, the distance that you can have, helicopter view, where you could say, where does this plan make sense? I don't necessarily understand all the detail, but I understand how a factory runs. I understand how the negotiation with the client is done and so on. But does it make sense from the total perspective of the company? That's one of the aha moments that I had as a GM, is to accept that this is not about adding and have a point of view on everything that is presented to me, but really making sure that I would have an impact on the things which are important and also give a strong direction. You come back to the idea, of strategy. I think the beauty and the important part of a general manager is to be able to define the strategy and explain it very clearly to the team, and after also to make decisions. I think the best managers are also the one deciding, ideally deciding quickly, and therefore you can decide and move on. And then you decide, you move on, and then you execute. And if need be, you adjust. So there is also no need to stay forever in a situation if it doesn't work. But this is idea of being able really to guide the team. I discovered the importance and the quality of this decision making.
It's interesting to hear you speak about the fact, like you said, once you go from a marketing director to a general manager, the scope from a functional standpoint that you have responsibility for obviously increases. I wanted to ask you a slightly different iteration in terms of like what that move may have meant in regards to not just managing a bigger team in terms of the number of people and obviously the number of functions, but also what that meant in terms of being able to successfully manage upward as well in an organization. Because I imagine that once you achieve that level as a GM, at that point, you also need to make sure that you're effectively communicating and that you're building trust with people at the C level, if you will, at a company.
Yeah, and that's extremely important. And very often, that's really the added value you can bring to your team when you go to a country, for example. This is about building trust, as you said exactly. For me, the upward management is first to create a trust relationship, normally very much by being reliable and being honest and transparent. I think that's very important, so that you can, if people would trust you at the C level, then you would have the space to do what you need to do in your business. And you would also create the space for your team. Another thing I was trying to train my team on is this idea that at the end of the day, everyone is responsible for the upward management, not only me as the boss of the country, but every department. And it makes no sense if one department would say A to these upward channels, another one would say B, and a third one would say C, because then people would say, what is really happening in this country? What's the message in this country? And this, I can see, I'm still bringing a lot of value on that in trying to sometimes give wider perspective to a team in a country, in a department, in a factory, to say, this is how you are perceived currently. This is how your business is perceived. And this is the filter people have when they listen to you. And it's very important that they are aware of this so that they would position their message differently. And the third thing on upward management, which I think is very important, is this idea of less is more. Sometimes this is not about the quantity of information you give. This is about the quality and the clarity of the message. I worked with many different nationalities and different cultures, as you may imagine. And not everyone is trained on that. Not everyone is sharp and crispy on that. Not everyone is also speaking naturally English as a mother tongue. So it's very important that you make sure that your team is very clear on the message that they want to give, and they give it in a very clear way and crispy way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also how you can help the team to manage the upward management. And you as a GM, at the end of the day, you're responsible for your business. So you're also responsible for the way it is communicated outside and upwards.
How do you combine that work of filtering between HQ and your team in country with also giving the opportunity of your team to shine in front of your boss, let's say? So
yeah, they have to shine. I mean, that's your job of a manager. You have to make your people shine. And one of my senior managers told me that one day. He said, Antoine, you're really making your people shine. And I think it was one of the best compliments he could give to me. At one point, you understand as a manager that it's not about you shining. It's about the team shining all together. If not, you're not successful. This is about creating the space and the context for them to shine. Obviously, it's not only giving them the visibility, because if they have the visibility, but they're all not well prepared, or the topic is too complicated, or the topic is not solved yet, then you're not helping them. So as a manager, you have to also help them to prepare, to package their message in this idea of less is more, in this idea of giving clarity. For me, I'm also a big fan of transparency. If you don't know, you don't know. And it's important to say it. Don't pretend. So this is really my core values of business: simplicity, transparency, honesty. And I think with that, you really manage a lot of, in a quality way, the upward team and the upward streams, because people can see you're not hiding something, but you also very much in a constructive mindset. You take ideas, you take inputs. What a boss would always love to hear is that first you like his idea or her ideas, you build on it, but you're not necessarily saying yes, but. So that's also what I was training my team with. You don't need to say yes to everything, but please don't say no to everything also.
Yeah, I think that's the combination of having a bit that political acumen, but at the same time, being able to be honest, transparent, and ultimately being yourself, and adding value.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I think, like you said it so well, which is that the job of a good leader, of an effective leader, is preparing their team to succeed, whether it be in their day-to-day activities or whether it be, like you said, in those situations where they're speaking to upper management as well. Because when they shine, you shine, everybody shines. So that's the key.
Yeah, and it took me a couple of years to understand that. And I think that's really the change that every manager should really do. When you have big teams, this is not necessarily about you only. It's really about the team. And this is about making them shine for sure. That's really a transformational change, I believe, that I would wish to every manager.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about what I would think to be one of the other key responsibilities for an effective leader, which is setting the vision for the team as well. In essence, giving them a North Star to be able to then go and execute against. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in regards to situations or your prior roles where you've gone about setting that vision, and tell us a little bit about how you went through that process of setting the vision and ultimately implementing that vision with the team?
Yeah, I did a couple of turnarounds in my career. I'm not sure if it's the easiest way to do a nice career, but this is my karma in a way, to make turnarounds. So I have to accept that. If I'm honest, I think I like it. And one of the key points for me in the turnaround is first to set up the right strategy. This is normally a new strategy. It may be a bit in continuity on some points, but it has to be a very clear North Star, as you said, for the team. Because when you do a turnaround, you need to give a reason also for the people to understand why they are going to be successful. And you need to give them also a guidebook in a way of what to do and what not to do. In a way, a strategy is also to say what you want to do, but what you will also not do. And that's I think, is very important. If you want to change a direction of a company, the team has to also understand what you will stop doing. Activities, meetings, many different products. Many different examples I could give, because normally a turnaround is also about doing less but better and bigger. And this is a very big phrase that you hear everywhere: bigger, better, less, bigger, better. But that's still true. After 25 years in business, I would say that's still very true. What's not easy is necessarily to find the big ideas, but you can make many ideas bigger than what you think they could be. And then you come to attitude. When you do a turnaround, it's not about changing the full team and saying no one can make it. It's also about giving the right North Star to the team and helping the team to perform, giving them, the direction and the frame to perform and the space also. And I've seen so many nice team performance and transformation of people, even the same people in my team with different type of management. They really gave their best. They really transformed. And they really felt that they had really an opportunity to add value to the business. So that's why I think strategy is so important, because this North Star is not only defining a nice PowerPoint deck and saying what you're going to do, but it's also giving a frame to your team to operate.
Out of curiosity, and actually this question can go to both of you, actually, since you've been in the workforce for some time, did this idea of vision exist 20 years ago? And this is a question that could go to both you guys. Like, I feel like it may be a modern concept of something that exists but wasn't talked about, but maybe I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, you're feel free to tell me.
I don't think it's a new idea. I think it's been around for quite some time. I think maybe the frameworks or the terminology, the labels that we're using for it may be slightly different. So I'll give you an example from my background, then I'd love to hear Antoine's experience with this as well, is that at Coca-Cola, we used to have something called OBPPC, which was our framework in regards to defining different objectives that we would have at a brand level, pack level, channel, customer level. And that was pretty detailed, I would say. In some cases, maybe perhaps a bit too much detail, but that was the framework that I think to this day Coca-Cola still uses in regards to setting their objectives for the different functions in the company. The last 6 years, having worked in startups, what they've done is they've streamlined that kind of model. I think it actually was born at Intel into the OKRs, so objectives and key results, but it's basically very similar. And I think that vision and setting a vision is something that's, pretty fundamental to strategy. I mean, it's been around for quite some time. Like I said, I think maybe the labels or the terminology we're using may have changed, but I think it's something that's been around definitely as long as I've been in the business world. But Antoine, what's your perspective?
No, I would agree that, luckily we have not invented vision recently, and it's a long one. When you see, old companies built in the 18th, 19th century and still being around, the founder had a vision. That's for sure. You can see that, especially family companies like the one I'm working for currently at Henkel. The founders had a vision. After, with the new generation, visions and purpose and all of those important holistic view of the company are even more important. Vision, because I think our world is becoming more and more complex. So therefore, you have to know where you go. But also vision to give a sense to your employees and also give a reason for your team to join you. I think is also for the young generation extremely important. They have a choice now today. They have a choice to work with you or not. They have to choice to join your team, your company. And they will also make a choice based on of leadership, quality of leadership, obviously, but vision, purpose of the company. And that's why I believe, Daniel, maybe you have the feeling it's becoming even more important today, and maybe it was therefore recreated in a way.
I think it ties back to one of your fundamentals, your key principles, Antoine, which is transparency. Is that I think what has evolved and what has become more prevalent has been that employees at companies, as well as consumers are demanding greater transparency in regards to companies' vision and their overall purpose as well. So I think, Daniel, to your original question, I think that is something that has definitely evolved over the last 5 years. At least my observation, it's evolved quite a lot in those 5 years.
Yeah, that was my feeling as well. That would have been what prompted me to ask the question. Antoine, how's the last 2 years been for you? Obviously, the world has changed a lot. How did you manage from your perspective, especially in terms of like leadership, COVID, and also, if you like, what type of impact do you think it will have on leadership?
Apart from the difficult part of managing the business with all the disruptions linked to COVID, and the change of behaviors from our consumers, our customers, the panic moment, the hamster shopping, as we call it here in Germany, of people stocking themselves and so on. I think what I want to remember from those years, and it's most probably not really over, is this idea of how do you manage the team remote? How for someone like me, you stop traveling and you are in a way visiting virtually a country. And so in a way, you have to be even more curious. You have to be even more listening to the team when you do a Turkish visit via Zoom, or if you do a business review with a country in Russia or wherever. That's really a strong moment of leadership and management, to be very sure that you're adding really value and to your team while not being with them. And I have to be honest with you, at the beginning of the COVID, it was not necessarily easy because I felt, I'm stuck here at home in my apartment. My job is to cover a big region, visit teams. I used to travel almost every week, and now I'm stuck at home. How can I add value to my team? What's my role really? Because do they still need me? And I think you come back again to the question of where do you add value? What do you want to touch? Where do you want to give an input? How you extract yourself a bit from the day-to-day work, and you give also a vision to the team of what you want to do, what you don't want to do. You can also make a bit of a comparison between all the different countries and to say, hey guys, what you see in Germany is actually also happening in Russia and in Spain. So this is not specific to you. This is like really a consumer trend. So this was really something I was trying to do. Honestly, I was impressed by the quality of the reaction of my team. And I would say almost of everyone. This world was able to work virtually, which is also giving me a lot of trust in humanity, and this idea that, we are able to make it also. So you can trust your team. You don't need to be next to them. You can give them the space and then they will work whenever they want. Sometimes, you had months, you had people not having the right connection at the right moment. You had sometimes even people working with kids not far away from the computer, but it worked. And I think we proved again that trust and space for the team can work. After, we also eagerly waiting to come back together. And then when we could do that in between periods, this was nice to see each other, to hug each other. And one of the most common comments I had with people I only met virtually and said, wow, you're much taller than expected. And in some cases, you're also smaller than expected. But this is one of the main comments. But I think we should learn this will continue to be partly virtual. And I think that's also okay. This will also give freedom to the team sometimes to say, and what, next week I'm working from home. What, next week I'm working from my holiday home, even, by the way, because then I can bring the kids and no problem with that. So, and that's also a question the new generation is asking us, what's your working from home policy, or that's a question they have. And I think we will have to be flexible. You don't always needs to be next to each other, 10 in a room to have a good meeting. That's also the learning of COVID.
I think I learned a new principle that we can add to your list, which is flexibility. That's something that's definitely, we've all had to become more flexible, or as a friend of mine likes to say, actually, Daniel, it's our mutual friend. He says, you have to be scrappy as well. What I loved about your response, Antoine, was leaning into curiosity, because like you said, it's easy when we're all in some ways isolated from one another from a physical proximity standpoint to be less curious, whereas like you've taken the opposite approach, which is you've really leaned into it. And you said, it's an opportunity for me to be even more curious with my teams.
But if I may say, FMCG is all about, not only, but it's a lot about curiosity. Because if you're not curious of where are your consumer going to be in 10 years, which store is going to sell your product in 10 years, if you're not curious in those key questions, you will not be successful and your company or your product will disappear. So this is the idea, of always trying to learn new things, discover new things, grow with the team, grow with the consumers, and try still to keep your North Star. So that's why I think curiosity is one of my main drivers for sure. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question that we ask all our guests on the FMCG Guys podcast, Antoine, to wrap this up, which is, if you were to talk to yourself, to your own self 20 years ago, I guess that could be applied to one of your kids. What type of lesson would you give them in terms of like going into the workforce and doing well in your career?
So I'm talking to my daughter, 25, correct? That's what you asked me now.
For example.
Yeah, I would say first, know what you want to do. I think it's very important, or it's good for a career to have a plan. You don't necessarily need to execute it fully, but by having a plan, I think it's easier to know where to go, where not to go, what job to accept. And therefore, I see a career also a bit as a chess game, of trying to move in the right direction. Not necessarily always straightforward. It can be side moves and so on, but you know where you're going. And you also try to build something which makes sense. Stay open, stay curious, as you understood. That's also something which is very important for me, and stay flexible. And also know where you're strong, because this is not all about only correcting your weakness. That's very important to correct your weakness, especially if they will be blockers, but make your strength stronger. I think that's also interesting. And I would say that in many cases for me, it's not about skills. It's about attitude. It's about emotional intelligence. It's how you bring people with you. It's not about you having the best skills and being the best. Rarely. It's about you being able to bring the best people in a group, in a problem-solving mode, and therefore winning as a team. So that's the advice I would give to someone 20 years younger.
What a great conversation, Ephraim. What an incredible lessons learned, not only about leading teams, but also that international exposure. And also, we didn't mention it to Antoine, but all with 5 kids.
Yeah, it's quite impressive to see and to learn about everything he's accomplished, both from a professional, but also, as you said, from a personal standpoint as well, in regards to having a large and loving family with him as well. As I listened to Antoine sharing his perspectives on his over his career, there were just a couple of really key takeaways for me from that conversation. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, I loved hearing about his guiding principles. To me, I think, talking about reliability, transparency, simplicity, and flexibility, those to me are foundational elements for any leader in the FMCG and retail industry. So I think those are really key takeaways from this conversation that we just had. Secondly, loved his comments and his stories around making your people shine, and understanding that as you grow as a leader, you start to realize that it's not only about you, but it's empowering and positioning your teams to succeed. And as a result, the whole team succeeds, him included as well. And then last but not least, I just really was able to empathize a lot with his comments around leaning into curiosity, particularly during these COVID times where physical proximity was a challenge, or continues to be a challenge. But instead of looking at that as a deterrent, thinking about leaning into curiosity and asking more questions and being a more active listener to better engage with your team, to me, that was really, really powerful, and something that I will definitely take away from our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we don't really talk about, but I think that leadership can only also be a very lonely place, especially at these levels where you don't necessarily have you're not part necessarily of a team as you are maybe when you're a manager or a senior manager. Yeah.
And I hope that that's one of the things that we're able to help accomplish through our podcast together is that, like you said, being a leader can be a bit of a lonely situation. So perhaps we're able to help make some of those connections among leaders across the various industries and the various companies that we'll be talking to make it a bit of a less lonely place for them.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea of the FMCG guys, to build a community in our industry of peers as well. And yeah, finally, to our audience, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn. We have a brand new LinkedIn page. You can find us obviously by looking for FMCG Guys, and you'll be able to stay up to date on our latest free content. And of course, let me take the opportunity also to wish our audience a great start to 2022. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out for any content or guest suggestions or for any criticism you may have. I love criticism. I love feedback. So don't hesitate to get in touch. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode.